One of the things that stood out to me was how many nonprofit workers are actually experiencing food insecurity themselves. So the study found that 30% of nonprofit workers in Canada are experiencing food insecurity. For me, like I have a background fundraising for organizations that do food security work, right? So how are we okay with doing this at the expense of our staff, who are often our biggest stakeholder? I would say they spend the most time, effort, energy there, but we're not okay with our community going through those issues, right? We're causing them for our staff and we're solving them for our community.
Hi, friends! Ever wondered how you could turn your big ideas into results? Together, let's reimagine a better sector, tackle systemic issues, and yes, raise some serious cash. Welcome back to The Small Nonprofit, the podcast where your passion meets action.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. Today, we're talking about a new report from Future of Good called the Changemaker Wellbeing Index, talking all about why you're feeling so tired. If you're new here, my name is Maria Rio, and I'm an expert fundraiser with over a decade of fundraising experience, and I'm on a mission to help EDs get more funding without the stress. Today, I'm joined by Caitlin. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Maria. I'm Caitlin McBride. I'm a certified fundraising executive, also with over a decade of experience, and I'm here to make fundraising feel less chaotic and more doable for small nonprofits.
So you brought this study to my attention from the Future Good, which is a Canadian organization, but I'm sure a lot of this is also felt in our American colleagues or American organizations. I would love to hear a little bit about what really drew your attention to this study.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I kind of love that it is Canadian data. We don't have as much of that. So it feels interesting to be like, this is Canadian data, but I'm sure we can extrapolate it to the US because usually it's vice versa. So it's nice to have something that is, yeah, really focused on the Canadian landscape as well. But yeah, so this is from Future of Good. This was released earlier this year. So it's a 2025 study, and a survey went out in February or March 2025. And I just found it so striking. So this is assessing like the well-being index and basically how nonprofit workers are across the country in terms of food security, in terms of mental health, in terms of well-being, in terms of financial security, all of those kind of things. And I think the results to me were like we always kind of knew that nonprofit workers were underpaid and at risk of burnout, but the results here were so stark and so striking that I really wanted to show it to as many people as possible and yeah, get into it and talk about it because nonprofit workers are not okay. And we need to do something about that.
So we'll definitely add the full study to the show notes. But one of the things that stood out to me was how many nonprofit workers are actually experiencing food insecurity themselves. So the study found that 30% of nonprofit workers in Canada are experiencing food insecurity. For me, like I have a background fundraising for organizations that do food security work, right? So how are we okay with doing this at the expense of our staff, who are often our biggest stakeholder? I would say they spend the most time, effort, energy there. Um, but we're not okay with that being the result. But we're not okay with our community going through those issues, right? We're causing them for our staff and we're solving them for our community.
Yeah. And I think it's very, I mean, be hypocritical is too strong a word, but it feels like somewhere in that vein to be like serving a community, but yet not prioritize the well-being of your staff enough to pay them enough to not be experiencing the same hardships, like a catch-22 almost, or like a circular sort of thing. Like you're creating this problem at the same time as you're trying to solve it. Like it doesn't make sense. There's this very, very long-standing narrative of, nonprofit workers shouldn't be paid as much because they're doing good and that should be enough. Doing good doesn't put food on the table. And just because somebody wants to do good in the world, like why should that come at the expense of their well-being, like their health even?
Especially with something like food insecurity, which is such an issue that's exclusively tied to income. So we know that these low salaries are causing people to become food insecure. And maybe it's a little bit anecdotal, but many of the frontline staff actually had a second job with another nonprofit to try to make ends meet. And it wasn't uncommon. I'm sure many of our listeners, either they've had a second nonprofit job or they know someone who has, because we're just not paying well enough. We're not really investing in the well being of our staff. And people are having to do what they can to get by. But unfortunately, it's not very sustainable. And that's something that this report actually really highlights very clearly. It also said 36% reported having poor well being. So obviously, this is taking a toll.
Yeah, and the report does a really good job at diving deeper into where those aspects of poor well-being are highlighted and where they are the most stark. And it actually shows that when you look at the different nonprofit sectors, about 49%, so nearly half of people in arts, culture, and recreation report poor well-being, whereas what they call government linked, so schools, universities, and hospital foundations, the rate of poor well-being is 32%, which is still not great, but you can definitely see there's a pretty stark divide between the different sectors, even within the nonprofit sector. And I think we extrapolate a little bit here that the kind of government linked nonprofits, so the schools, universities, and hospital foundations, are usually funded, more stable, those kinds of things. Whereas your community nonprofits, they're doing the frontline work, but they're not getting the stability and the support that they need. And it's just this constant living on a shoestring kind of thing and trying to do more with less for a lot of the community nonprofits who are doing some of the most critical work in communities and really supporting people who are the most vulnerable.
So, something in the study that also caught my eye is how many people who are frontline entry level people are experiencing that poor well being versus people in senior management and leadership, right? So, about half reported poor well being if you're an entry level or frontline person. And if you're a senior leadership person, that is about 30%. So 20% less reports having poor well being. So that to me is really interesting because there's actually been studies on how your brain chemically changes as you become higher in your company, as you have more power, more wealth. You are actually less empathetic to people who have less power and less wealth. So I think that on its own is a big red flag to how our staff are experiencing the nonprofit and how the leadership are experiencing the nonprofit. Also, we know that if there's an issue, the people who are getting fired are not going to be the executive director and your director of programs, director of fundraising. Those are usually the people who are kept the safest. So I think there's an additional like job insecurity fear that can kick in as well.
Yeah, definitely. And that was a really scary stat for me as well, because these are people who are just starting off in the nonprofit sector. Like, this is the future of the sector. And if like nearly half of them are experiencing poor mental health or well-being, food insecurity, financial insecurity, burnout, what does our sector look like in 10 years with those people who are maybe not going to stick around? And yeah, that was another thing that we pulled out of the study that I think shook us both, which is that workers who quit nonprofits do tend to leave the sector entirely. And it showed that more than 70% of people quit the nonprofit sector. So that is a huge loss. And yeah, it makes me really worried for the future and people who are not getting the support that they need early in their careers to be able to progress and move up to those senior level positions and be able to lead and drive nonprofits in the future.
For me too, when I was working in-house, like I would go from one organization to the next, looking for a better culture, looking for people who valued my expertise, who valued my well-being, who didn't want to work me to death, right? And it was very, very difficult to find an organization where the leadership was even kind of normal, right? So I can't imagine if you've done that 4 or 5 times, how exhausting just the job search process is trying to find a good place to be, but also like how demoralizing it is to end up in the same boiling pot of water every single time that you do, right? So I can definitely see why people are choosing to leave the sector entirely. But as you're saying, like that does open up a lot of questions around like, what does the future of the sector look like? And brain drain, I would say. We're losing our best people who have the experience. And for the people who are coming into the sector, we're not treating them in a way where they can see this being their career for the next 30 to 50 years.
Yeah, it's really sad. And I think back to when I started in the sector, which was over a decade ago now, and just how different it must be. And I think that maybe that's something that senior leadership are missing when thinking about entry level workers and managing entry level workers now, to have that kind of empathy and to understand that things are different now. I always have to remind myself that those people who are younger, earlier, starting their careers and everything at this moment, they also went through some very formative years in their life during one of the biggest crises we've ever seen, which was COVID. So I really always try to remember that when I am working with somebody who's a little bit younger and a little bit more junior, that they went through something really traumatic, basically, during those formative years of their life. And I want to give that empathy and I want to give that space for growth because we have to invest in this cohort and we have to invest in this future because what sector do we have left? If 70% of people are leaving and we're not treating our entry level workers with dignity and respect and care.
In the past, when I was considering, like, oh, maybe I should move to a different organization or something like that, I did a lot of research on how often do fundraisers leave their role? Like, how long do they stay in a role? And now I know it's around 12 to 18 months. But I just wonder, like, for other roles that are not fundraising, if they see as high of a turnover because of these chronic and well documented issues and why we haven't been able to fix them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think on the fundraising side, that's always really rocked me as well, because especially in fundraising, which is such a relationship based role, and like it can take 12 to 18 months to even build and develop relationships. And then that seems to be the tenure for a lot of fundraisers. And that's something that needs to be looked at and changed. And I think we've talked a lot about how we measure success in fundraising and change that and support fundraisers so they don't burn out. But I would be curious to dive in deeper into the various roles. I think we definitely know that the frontline staff have a high risk of burnout and everybody's asked to do more with less. And even just being in some of those roles and experiencing vicarious trauma from supporting people through really, really difficult experiences. I spent a lot of my career a little bit more behind the scenes, but working in organizations that supported families who had a child with a cancer diagnosis. So that even having a bit of a distance there as a fundraiser, I could still come along sometimes with that family's journey. And it was emotionally draining. So I can't imagine people who are on frontline and really getting to know a story and everything. It's really, really hard and really taxing. But I would love to see the difference there and if there is a higher rate across different positions.
Have you seen people take stress leave before?
Not in the organizations I worked in. And this may have been a kind of situation where somebody should have taken stress leave, but the organizations that I worked in were always much smaller and more grassroots. So when you have 6 people in the entire organization, the pressure to not leave a role empty and not take stress leave is pretty high. But in other organizations, I've definitely seen people take stress leave, and more often than not, I've seen people take stress leave and not return. What about you?
So I've seen a lot of people take stress leave and then instead of trying to work it out with their employer, like go on short-term disability. It's so stressful. It's so unbelievably hard that, as you're saying, like people choose not to come back or they try to wait it out for like 6 months on a short-term disability until some of those issues are resolved. Unfortunately, those issues are rarely resolved when they come back. One of our clients right now, how they're experiencing this is their director of fundraising is on stress leave. They haven't come back. It's been like 6 months. Their ED, who just replaced their other burnt out ED, is now also on stress leave. Hopefully they come back, but now they've hired an interim person and 2 other people to replace the director of development, and they're also stressed out because their biggest fundraiser is coming up in September, right? So there's not enough time to get it right. There's a lot of pressure, and the people who have the most knowledge are not around because they were way too burned out to continue doing the job. At one point, you have to look at your situation and say, "Woof, this is not good for the rest of my life." Like, I would rather work in marketing for Coca-Cola. At least they're not asking me to put on an accent. At least they're not, telling me I had to raise the whole budget by myself.
Yeah, it's wild. And I think, there's burnout everywhere. This is not just like the only people that burn out are people in the nonprofit sector. But what I really liked about this study was that it did a really good comparison of people who were in the nonprofit sector and people who weren't. It wasn't just looking at the nonprofit sector and it didn't just survey people in the nonprofit sector. Also, what I thought was interesting was that the people who were doing the survey weren't told that it was a survey about the nonprofit sector. So I think it created probably a level playing field and honesty but it did also allow them to compare the rates of burnout within the nonprofit world versus the corporate and for-profit worlds. It was very clear that it is a higher burnout rate in the nonprofit sector. Like we do have the data to prove that now, which is, I feel like we all knew it anecdotally, but now to have this data, I think is really powerful. So I think the next question, maybe what we should move on to is what do we do with this data? Like, how do we move forward? What solutions do we have? Maria, solve the problem.
Okay, so here's what I'm thinking. Okay, and this is what I try to do with Further Together. So, trying to hit as many of the decent work checklist items as you can, right? So, if you can do a 4-day work week and that's a way that you can compete, do that. If you can compete on having a great culture, do that, right? So, push all the levers that you can to make your nonprofit the most attractive place to work and to continue to stay, right? And I think that's one of the things that will really make a difference for the future of nonprofits because as these organizations are losing funding, losing staff, they'll continue to close. Right. We'll see more and more organizations close. They don't have a fundraiser. They don't have frontline staff. They can't maintain it. Your ED is on stress leave, X, Y, and Z. So we would have to move towards a place where nonprofits are competitive employers, as competitive as we're asking for profits to be, because there's more than one way to do good. And right now, nonprofits are acting like there's not. Like we're the main avenue for doing good. But now that doing good is a commodified thing, like I can work for Home Depot and hand out money there. That's doing good. I can work at a social enterprise and sell t-shirts there. So there's so many different ways to do good and to live in alignment with your values that if we're not doing that for our staff, which is also the main reason people come work in nonprofit to live in alignment with our values, then how can we engage donors? How can we retain our staff? And how can we move forward? So I think that centering people's well-being will take you such a far way and also really trying to be empathetic to the reality of living in a city or in your local area. You can't get by on a $50,000 salary. Wherever you're living, wherever you're listening to this, you cannot get by on $50,000. Like you need money to go on vacation, to retire, to face any emergencies that you might have. So really doing all the things that focus on creating a strong work culture, making sure that your employees' well-being is respected because also you will have a bigger impact on their health than their doctor. And that's something you need to take very, very seriously. And thinking ahead. So I love how you mentioned the future of nonprofit because some people are just trying to make it to December. What does this look like? What does your organization sustainability look like in 5 to 10 years? If your staff attrition, you're not even tracking it, if you haven't started even using AI, if you have no idea how to create a budget, like these are serious challenges that create so much instability and burnout and redundancy in your organization. So taking the time to build those systems will really set you up for success. What do you think, Caitlin?
I can't follow that. That was a mic drop. I didn't think you would actually solve the problem, but I think you got it. I love everything that you said. There are so many different ways to do good and being able to work for a bank and support their foundation and support their work. Yeah, doing good in the world is not just a USP of nonprofit work now. And I have a really good friend who started off as a fundraiser. She's probably the smartest and most amazing person I know. And she now works for a bank because she burnt out and we lost her in the sector, but she's still able to support their foundation and live a good life. So it's things like that that I think about where I'm like, there's an organization out there that would have benefited so much from having her as their director of development and would have been able to change lives. We lost people like that. And just adding on that we really need to change the narrative in the sector that working in nonprofit, you have to have this kind of like self-sacrifice. You have to sacrifice your well-being, you have to sacrifice your pay and your mental health because you're doing good. We need to, as you said, have the nonprofit sector be a competitive employer. And we have to not just prioritize things like growth for growth's sake, really prioritize the well-being of our people and our community. And if that means scaling back on some of the things that you're doing in order to prioritize sustainability of your organization, that's okay. We're not the corporate sector. We don't have to go by the motto, if you're not growing, you're dying. I think it's more important to have sustainable programs and be serving your community for the long term than to be having a revolving door of staff and employees and a terrible workplace and just being able to show a couple of incremental percentage points on some of your reports.
Oh, I love everything that you said. I do want to add growth for growth's sake is actually a sign of white supremacy. right? Like that individualism, not being rooted in community, wanting to be above others. Like these are all signs of white supremacy. So, like moving towards community building, being rooted there, and trying to take care of your people as best as you can is just like such a nicer way forward. And it's more aligned with what your stated values are.
Agreed. So I feel like this has been a bit of a downer episode, but I feel like there's hope. I'm definitely getting the sense, or I have gotten the sense, at least in the last 5 years, that funders are actually coming around to this shift and they're listening. There's some funders who are amazing partners and really listening to the fact that they need to fund staff salaries, and staff are the people who are doing the work. And this is going to take a long time. This narrative that people who are in the nonprofit space don't need money for some reason goes back a long way. I'm watching The Gilded Age right now, and there's lots of charitable work, but it's so interesting because you can see where that started, because it started with these very aristocratic women who were using it as more of a social climbing ladder, and there wasn't the need to value anything from them or to give them value back. So I think that's my draw for The Gilded Age right now. But this is a long time narrative and a very ingrained narrative that nonprofit workers don't need to or shouldn't be paid the same as a for-profit or corporation. We're slowly starting to change it, but I'm seeing progress, and I think there's definitely hope out there.
So if you're listening to this, I hope that you're taking some time to address that burnout because it's not just you, it's systemic, right? In the words of Trisha Hershey, rest is resistance, rest is anti-capitalist. Let's move towards this in a unified direction, not just saying this is what we believe in and doing something completely different, but actually put your money where your mouth is, right? So if you need rest, don't be scared to ask for it. If you need to slow down the organization as the ED, that is probably one of the most sustainable things that you could do to level up your organization and secure its future. So, hoping that you got a lot out of today's episode. As always, if you would like to see our lovely faces, you can check out our YouTube channel. But that's it for today's episode. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Small Nonprofit. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to connect with our guests directly or find me on LinkedIn. Let's keep moving money to mission and prioritizing our well-being. Bye for now.